want to give credit where credit's due. A lot of the stuff that I'll be talking with you about and have been talking with you about today is drawn from Lynch's book on public budgeting, and also from a number of works by a really significant writer in this area by the name of Aaron Wildavsky. And I want to spell his name for you because I'm going to mention several books and encourage you to take a look at these. Wildavsky. Again, Aaron Wildavsky. Wildavsky. Now, Wildavsky died, I believe it was in 1973. But before his death, he wrote a book called The Politics of the Budgeting Process. He also wrote a tremendous book with a tremendous title called Speaking Truth to Power. And Wildavsky was particularly concerned with, actually, I'll hold back on that one. Roland Warren wrote Speaking Truth to Power. So it's the politics of the budgeting process. Wildavsky was very interested in budget behavior, both at an institutional level and at an individual level. And Wildavsky was one of the real proponents of the incremental approach, not necessarily because he argued that was the best approach to take, but rather that was the best way of understanding the budget behaviors that he was studying. Wildavsky had tremendous insight into the politics and the political games and the technical gimmicks that were used by budget actors to emphasize certain elements of truth and to obscure other elements of truth, all in the service of a political agenda that was being battled in a budget environment. So I strongly encourage you to read Wildavsky. It's not dry reading at all. So if you're thinking that you're going to be reading something that might be full of formula or dry kinds of technical minutia about how one constructs a budget, no, it's not that at all. It's really a very, very insightful description of the political game of budgeting. So do want to emphasize that, and it's also by way of a preliminary to this particular statement that essentially is a condensation of much of Wildavsky's work. That budget decisions are so frequently based less on the intrinsic merits of programs than they are on extrinsic factors, especially politics. And that's really an indictment of another and separate approach that I'll allude to in a little bit, which is the logical rational approach, where the notion here is that budgeting behavior is geared toward identifying and then realizing the single best set of options that are available for particular actors. That is to say that budget decisions are designed to maximize effectiveness and the impact of the resources that are allocated to particular programs or allocated across the society. Wildavsky would argue that while that might be the goal of some, it certainly isn't the realization of virtually any.
Could you repeat that quote? Budget decisions
Yeah, that budget decisions are based less on the intrinsic merits of programs than on extrinsic factors, and that's largely political factors. Another thing, this is essentially a paraphrase. Public budgeting is a political process conducted in the political arena for political advantage. And those of us who are in social work in Tennessee, in the academic side of the house, are looking at what and how the governor's budget bill plays out, because that bill calls for the elimination of Title IV-E funding for university-based 4E funding of trainers in DCS. That has potentially profound implications on the ability of the state to exit the Brian A. Case, under which Tennessee has been monitored by the court for a number of years.
So how they're eliminating the TCCW
Yes, that's what that particular budget calls for, and basically it involves foregoing $4.5 million of federal funds and the elimination of about 66 training positions that are university-based and 4E funded, although it's quite probable that DCS will hire a number of those trainers, but how many and where they'll be assigned yet to be determined. How that will be done yet to be determined. What that will mean in terms of the financial obligations that the state now assumes by increasing the public employee roster by hiring these trainers. There can be some computation of that, but
There's also talk that they're going to eliminate the stipend program, which is 4E funded.
actually the latest talk about that is that they're going to continue both the MSW and the BSW educational programs, one of which is largely gutted anyway. That the MSW one, to be frank about it, you're getting so little, no credit for the work that you're doing toward an internship, for example, on company time. But right now they're actually talking about maintaining the BSW and the MSW training programs, educational programs, even perhaps with a very, very modest increase in the budget that's going to go to that. Going to be very interesting, and so we're watching that. And what I might also add, that this is taking place against a budget document, if you will, a budget plan. But we're aware, I've been participating in conversations with social workers at NASW, Tennessee, at the different universities that are subcontractors of the 4E grant and have been providing training or provide the subsidy, the tuition subsidy BSW and MSW programs. And there's genuine political energy being devoted to developing a plan to influence policy, a political plan, including the efforts to find a Republican who will sponsor an amendment to the budget and push for that, which, by the way, so far seems to be unsuccessful. We're also seeing universities now beginning to back away from what was originally a dedicated effort to preserve the 4E program. So what's happened behind those closed doors, if you will, that has resulted in a shift at the highest levels of universities from moving aggressively to try and retain the 4E program to saying, no, we're going to go hands off on this. It's a political process. Other sacred cows, if you will, are on the table as well. Influence is being traded. And it's quite possible that the 4E program is simply going to be one of the sacrifices that are made in the political arena so that people can pursue other kinds of outcomes. Politics of budgeting. What else should we know about budgeting? Well, many of the modern reforms of budgeting were motivated in an effort to prevent or identify theft, corruption, or misapplication of funds. As I mentioned before, the line item budget is probably the supreme example of a product that serves that particular function. Now, a number of subsequent reforms were stimulated by efforts to improve planning. And you're going to see in just a moment, we're going to talk about PBS, Program Planning and Budgeting System, and also efforts to improve management efficiencies. We'll be talking about MBO, Management by Objectives, also called MBOR. It's a variation on that, Management by Objectives and Results. And we've also mentioned performance budgets that speak to this particular goal. So what are some of these major approaches to budgeting that would be important to know about? The incremental approach that I've mentioned, Wildowski being a champion of that, at least in terms of analysis of budgeting behavior. Here, that notion of the budget as an historical document and the budget as highly constrained by decisions of the past come into play. with an incremental approach to budgeting, the emphasis is on the margins. The emphasis is on increasing by a little or decreasing by a little sums that are devoted to particular programs or particular policy arenas. There's the satisficing approach. Now notice that word satisficing. This isn't satisfying, satisficing. Has anybody heard the term satisficing before? Do you remember what it means? Oh, yeah. Satisficing is...
I've heard it before. It's like sacrificing and satisfying.
Not quite. Although, ready for this? I'm going to go with that. You're going to sacrifice the search for the optimal or best solution so that you can simply satisfy your need to solve a problem. So satisficing is the process whereby an adequate, not an inadequate, but an adequate solution is found for a problem, and then one moves on. People who argue for the utility of a satisficing approach will generally not make the argument that this approach maximizes the success or that it's the most effective approach.
Is that short term?
Not necessarily short term at all, but by talking about term, you're talking about time, aren't you? The people who argue for the utility or the wisdom of a satisficing approach are very appreciative of the limited amounts of time and the limited amounts of energy that decision makers have as they search for solutions, as they analyze the possible and variety of outcomes of those different options, and then finally make a decision. Their argument is going to be something like this. We have more on our plate than we can possibly handle given the time and resources available to us and our own ability to analyze the data that we have available or to acquire it. We might be able to improve our performance on any of those kind of metrics, but it's going to be at the cost of much more time and much more energy. Oh no, guess what? The world continues to go round. Problems continue to mount. People continue to have problems even as we're devoting additional time to maximizing our analysis and maximizing the choice across options here. And in the end, when we do that, okay, maybe we've optimized one particular issue, but it's been at the expense of letting a variety of other things, right, go to Hades in a handbasket. So rather than do that, let's continue to look for options until we find one that works. And because it works, we can now choose that, move on, and address other problems. And in the long run, that's probably the better way to handle the issues that confront us with the resources we have. It's a good enough approach. Very much, it's a good enough approach. Right? And these would be the people who might say something like this, and this is a paraphrase, that the perfect is enemy to the good enough. Once we've identified something that's satisfactory for our purposes, let's don't continue to spend time and energy on this same matter because we've got other things that we have to do that are pressing as well. And then there's the ideal rational approach. And the ideal rational approach would be characterized by those folks that would say, no, we're not going to be content with satisficing here. We're going to look for the optimal solution, and we're going to use every kind of analytic tool that we have. We're going to exhaust options. We're going to analyze each. We're going to compare each with regard to outcomes and inputs that are required, and we'll then engage in a fair and rational process to decide which is the very best. Now, one of the problems, by the way, with the ideal rational approach, in addition to the difficulties of time and energy and analytic adequacy, is the fact that the ideal rational approach largely supposes that there's a single community of interest out there, that there's a single constituency that sees a problem in a similar way across membership, that seeks the same kind of outcomes. And in fact, the public policy arena isn't anything like that for most kind of issues. So the ideal-rational approach is a fairly difficult approach to accommodate against a polity that's differentiated by different values, different social and economic positions, and a lack of consensus. Now let's talk about some of the major budgeting initiatives that have been important in looking at the evolution of budgeting. And it's not just because this is important historically. There are elements of each of these approaches to budgeting that remain with us. That's really why this is important for us today. Program planning and budgeting system was a system that first saw light of day in a major way with the Ford Motor Company when Robert McNamara was the chief executive of Ford Motor Company. Now, when John Kennedy was elected in 1960, taking office in 61, Kennedy nominated, we just blocked on his name again, I just mentioned it, McNamara, to become Secretary of Defense. And McNamara brought with him the PPBS system from Ford and introduced it into the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, the program planning and budgeting system was this first major deliberate effort to marry budgeting with planning, to make it a single, seamless process. So you'll notice what this system, by its title, the planning of programs, the planning of budgeting, budgeting for programs, all linked together systematically. Now, the key thing about PPBS and what remains with us today were the analytical systems that were to be used to differentiate across different kind of options. We'll talk more than a little bit about those things in just a few minutes, but I'll mention them for you right now. Cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis. You've heard those terms before. Cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis. Cost-benefit analysis, the effort to identify and sum for a period of time, usually 5 to 7 years, or if shorter than that period, it would be the entire life of a program, all of the costs associated with the program. So it would be manufacturing costs, personnel costs, startup costs, other kind of operating costs, everything from paper and pens to buildings to training, technologies that would be involved. And then with cost-benefit analysis, the effort to express in dollar amounts the value of the output. Go ahead.
I think I have this question. What was effort to identify and sum for a period of time, all the costs associated?
All the costs. Now that's, by the way, that's going to be the same for both. It's not just a coincidence that the word cost is used both in benefit cost and cost effectiveness analysis. They mean exactly the same thing. They're computed in exactly the same way. All of the costs that go into the particular program for the life of the program, or if it's longer than 5 to 7 years, generally for a 5 to 7 year period of time. Okay? So once you've done that, you've got the cost part of the equation for either cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis. For cost benefit analysis, the outcomes are expressed solely in dollar amounts. So it's the dollar value you're getting by way of outcomes as compared to the total amount of money that's going into the program for the time period that you're talking about. Now, if you're in business and you're manufacturing widgets and selling widgets, that's not necessarily a bad way of doing things, of doing business. Because if it's going to cost you $2 million over 5 years to create widgets that are going to generate for your company $10 million, 2 million in, is that what I said? 10 million back? You're getting a 5-to-1 return for the amount of money that you've put into the manufacturing. You're expressing the outcomes in terms of dollar amounts. Now notice I didn't mention how many widgets you manufactured. That's largely irrelevant to this. I didn't mention how many widgets were destroyed or were faulty in terms of its production. That's not really too relevant to this. I'm not interested in this in terms of how those widgets are used. Are they used for good? Are they used for evil? That's irrelevant to cost-benefit analysis. The only thing that's relevant here is the dollar return for the amount of money we're investing in terms of the manufacturing of those widgets. So if it takes us $2 million to produce one $10 million widget that we successfully sell, or if it takes us $2 million to create 2 million widgets, each of which is successfully sold for $5, it doesn't make any difference. We're getting back $10 million for the $2 million we put into it, cost-benefit analysis. Okay? Before we even go on to cost-effectiveness analysis, right, think of yourself in the human services. Not hard to do. You are in the human services. Okay? Think of yourself in your work that you're doing or in your internships. Does cost-benefit analysis seem to be an adequate, an appropriate analytical method to use to help determine whether your program, whether your activities are worth the money that's going into those things?
No.
Why not? The answer is no. Why not?
Because you can't put a price on what we do in some cases.
Because you can't put a price on what we do in some cases.
Trying to express treatment outcomes in dollars.
It's hard to express treatment outcomes in dollars. Yeah. Now, most economists will say we can do that.
But it's easy to do that because we do so. What we do is not material. I mean, working with people is not like you are producing per se a product. So sometimes they just lump that up because it makes it easy not to delineate.
You might be able to express dollars in prevention,
Yeah, but if
in
a program is effective and it saves dollars for incarceration
Right.
or medical treatment, then
You can add that, can't you? If you can find something that's already available that can be conveniently, validly expressed as a dollar savings, for example, we might capture that, begin to list those things and sum them. Yes, you can do that. Yes, you can do that. Most economists would probably argue that you can go beyond that you can put dollar amounts to certain kinds of life experiences as well. After all, courts do that in lots of personal injury cases, don't they? You ever been on a jury that's maybe had to make a decision about the amount of money that perhaps a plaintiff must pay to a defendant to compensate for the loss of a limb, for emotional damage? That's really what's happening there, isn't it? A human experience that's being translated into some kind of dollar amount. Right? Now, it could well be that if the plaintiff and the defendant are both, let's say, lower working class individuals, that $10,000 and $10,000 have about the same kind of emotional and cognitive meaning to both. But I'm willing to bet you that $10,000 to a working class individual has a different cognitive and emotional value than $10,000 does to a multimillionaire. The same amount of money means something very, very different to those two individuals.
And isn't there something different psychological as money you're saving as opposed to money you can get directly in your hands within your pocket?
I would say that there is.
I mean, you can make the argument that, we're saving society X amount of dollars because we're producing citizens that are working, and it'll be less hindrance on your taxes, but people are wanting to see the cash amount in their hand.
Yeah, and I think that the meaning of money to people, for example, would be different as opposed to money that you earn versus money that you've won. Money that you've won by chance versus money that you've been given as a result of, let's say, a loss or suffering that you've experienced in some effort at justice that's been given. That there are different psychological and emotional events that are associated with the same amount of dollars across those three different kind of conditions. Now, we're just talking about now the different values that might be placed on a certain event based upon the context or based upon the individual and their socio-emotional, socio-cultural, and socio-economic status, etc. So what amount are you going to put in to compute your benefits sum in a cost-benefit ratio? If you're working with poor people, and you're working with poor people around marital therapy issues, you're working with people around the resolution of clinical depression, are you going to somehow use dollar values that make sense only to people from the socioeconomic lower class? Or are you going to use dollar amounts that make sense to a white-collar executive or analyst who's involved in the budget process? Well, I don't know what you're going to use, and I don't know if there's a right answer here. I think the one particular approach is to say that these things refer to what are called externalities. Externalities. And for our purposes, an externality is something that lies outside of an economic calculus. For our purposes, an externality is something for which you cannot place a logical, rational dollar amount to it. So when Mallory says something about, well, so much of the things that are essential in terms of social work and the work that we do with clients simply involve things where you can't put a dollar sign on it, then what she's saying is that these things are externalities. Well, in cost-benefit analysis, they're either not, which is to say you do assign a dollar amount to them, or you ignore them as a relevant feature of the outcome that's to be assessed. In cost-benefit analysis, you either count it as a dollar amount or you ignore it. Under the Reagan administration, cost-benefit analysis was decreed to be the analytical system that was required by the federal government during his administration. That was not an accident. That was consistent with an agenda. Okay? Shouldn't come as a surprise. Budgeting is a political process. Now, in contrast to cost-benefit analysis, there's cost-effectiveness analysis. Cost means the same thing across the two systems. It's computed the same way. It's summed the same way. It's expressed the same way. But now the outcome is expressed as the number of units effectively produced. Number of units effectively produced. So Christina, for example, in this case, we are in fact treating people who, let's say, who have undergone successfully some kind of intervention process that's been intended for them here as a unit effectively produced. So we might have, let's say, a day treatment program for 100 people. It was successful for 90. 90 becomes the denominator. 90 becomes the number of individuals who were successfully treated through this day treatment program. And what was the cost? Well, it's whatever we computed.
So there's two ways that you can do a PPBS, and that's cost-benefit analysis and cost-effective analysis, or do they go hand in hand?
Well, you can do both. You can do both. So, example, during the Reagan administration, a lot of people in human services required to do cost-benefit analyses would also offer a cost-effectiveness analysis as well. Right? But the program planning and budgeting system, a single approach to unifying planning and budgeting, required some kind of analytical system. And what it carried with it were these competing approaches, because they're not really complementary. One is ignoring a lot of what we in social work would regard as essential features of outcome. Or, if not ignoring it, arbitrarily assigning for a lot of the expression, the calculation of benefits, dollar amounts that were highly suspect at the very least, or arbitrary, or misleading. Oh, and by the way, if you're going to be treating certain kind of features of outcomes under cost-benefit analysis, and you're going to acknowledge that some are externalities, so that you're not going to assign a dollar amount to them, don't you think it would be possible to play politics and political games by making the choices as to which items to count for a dollar amount, which to ignore as an externality? So that if you wanted to diminish the value, the economic value of a program, you simply expand the number of externalities so that you don't have to add economic benefit, dollar benefits to that. Cost benefit, cost effectiveness analysis, still with us. PPBS, for the most part, not. Why? Because it was largely replaced by management by objectives. Kennedy administration, Nixon administration. Peter Drucker, also now deceased, but for his time kind of the guru of management science, largely associated with the founding of this particular approach. Now, as a management approach, management by objectives calls for a dialogue from the top of an organization to the bottom of the organization between the supervisor and the subordinate across every level of the hierarchy. And what does that dialogue involve? Well, it involves, in any order that you might want, the supervisor describing to the subordinate what is expected of him or her, the subordinate telling the supervisor what kind of support, what kind of training, what kind of resources the subordinate requires for that. Oh, and by the way, there might be better ways of doing things, or there might be other things that are important to be done from the perspective of the subordinate. So in theory, at least, management by objective is this process where there's systematic emphasis on clarity of communication between supervisor and subordinate, all the way from the top of the organization to the bottom and back and forth, so that in the end, everybody has clarity along a chain of command or a line of authority. And the later development of that was to add results. That is to say, it's not enough to be clear as to what you're supposed to be doing. It's also important to be very specific about what it is that you're to accomplish, what it is that you are to produce through that activity. Now, management by objectives, any kind of management system that involves systematic work toward the accomplishment of certain objectives is going to involve the requirement for resources to be devoted to that. Some of those resources are going to be monetary resources, and that's where budgeting comes into play. Wadowski points out that in the budgeting arena, that dialogue between supervisor and subordinate tends to be supervisor telling the subordinate, who then turns around and tells his or her subordinate, who then turns around and tells his or her subordinate. So there's not really a dialogue. It's a top-down approach to saying this is the way it's going to be, this is what you're going to do, or this is what you're going to do, and this is what you're going to achieve. And that gets built into a budgeting process. It all rolls downhill. That's right. That's right. And even from a management perspective, leaving aside the budgeting elements of that, there are relatively few organizations that really do a good job of creating the dialogue, supervisor and subordinate, and do it along a variety of levels of hierarchy. It tends to be, even as a management device, management trying to be clear to subordinate as to what is expected. And sometimes what, from the subordinate's perspective, what is required, what is asked for, at the very least, from management, but very little real negotiation about the nature of the job, and particularly if it involves a bottom-up approach to new products, new initiatives.
Is that different if there's a union involved?
Unions always change things, but even there, unions are at least officially constrained in terms of what they can collectively bargain. So it's wages, benefits, working conditions, for example. It's not products, it's not programming, it's not strategic initiatives. Those are, for the most part, outside of what a union can legally insist on engaging in.
What goes down, I mean, it doesn't affect the dialogue that you're saying, that it doesn't really have to, okay.
No, not in a formal way, but the presence of a union, the collective bargaining arrangement, does have a way of influencing virtually everything, affecting virtually everything within an organization. So we would probably find some nuances of that, but not in a major way.